So, Phil, you centered this book around basically 5 main characters. Timmy, who is, I'm going to forget his full name. What is his actual full name?
His full Indian name is Kodendera Subayya Thimayya.
Okay, thank you.
I'm in WhatsApp touch
Timmy.
with his grandson, so I think I have that pronunciation right.
And then there is Subhas Chandra Bose, the Indian nationalist, the rather controversial Indian nationalist.
The true hero of Indian independence, if you believe the current Prime Minister of India.
Yeah, I'm more of a Baba Saheb girl myself. And then there's Angela Noblet, a nurse, Arthur Titherington, who was a Japanese prisoner of war, and Douglas Brock Peterkin, a doctor.
Yes.
Can you tell me, when did you first get the idea? Did you always think that you would center it around a cast of characters? And why did you choose that particular cast of characters?
All the books I've done about the Second World War, this is the third, have used this approach. And I guess it really does grow out of a documentary tradition, which is my background. The very first book in this trilogy was based on a BBC One series I made over 20 years ago. And I think one thing you learn in television is you try and lead your storytelling with emotion. And there's nothing more emotional than the human face, the human story. So you may have things to say that are analytical about the military situation, the politics, and I have plenty of things to say about all those things. But if you can get people interested in people and lead that way, and there's a perfect example of that approach, I think, with Angela. You mentioned the nurse woman I was destined to meet and marry, but sadly I never did. I mean, I'm rather in love with her. I think that's obvious from the way I write about her. Remarkable person. Anyway, she, amongst the various adventures and things that happened to her, is that she's an eyewitness to the Bengal famine, which is a hugely important and terrible part of this story. But rather than writing a sort of essay about the famine, I wanted to just get involved by a moment of personal experience. And she has this remarkable moment where she sees people trying to get food from a goods train by poking sticks up through the floors into the sacks of rice and catching the trickle that comes out. And it's a very, very affecting story for her. And it's, I hope, for the reader too. You suddenly see there the human reality of something as massive as the Bengal famine. And then that gives you the excuse. You hooked them. So you talk a little bit more about the story of the famine. So that's a long-winded way of trying to explain my style. I actually had many more characters than the 5 you mentioned. At the beginning, I threw quite a lot away because I thought there's a lot going on, so I dropped quite a few people. But I guess I wanted people who were in interesting places and fresh voices. You know, it's good to get people who have not been exposed that much. I mean, Bose is very, very famous in India. But to be honest, outside India, not many people know much about him. And the others, I think, are largely unknown. So yeah, that's the rationalization for the kind of narrative style that I've chosen to follow.
I'd like to start with maybe Bose and Timmy. So these are 2 figures who both played a kind of military, in Timmy's case, definitely a military role, and in Bose's case, a kind of quasi-military role. They were both Indian patriots. They were both in favor of Indian independence. They lived at the same period. And Timmy actually had a brother who fought in Bose's Indian National Army. And yet they pursued completely different career paths and took completely different attitudes towards how to strive for Indian independence and how to work with the British. Can you talk a little bit about those contrasting strategies?
You know, I was looking for a way of telling the story of how India progressed to independence through the war. Because the big story of this book is the empire and what's going to happen to the empire and how the empire, the British themselves, will respond to the growing clamours for decolonialisation right across the world. Bose, I knew I wanted to write about because it's such an interesting and incredibly what's the word? Ambiguous character. I really wanted to write about him. But Timmy is the perfect intercut, another television term. If you can juxtapose 2 people through a storyline, it gives the story energy. And these 2 men, as you say, they were both about the same age. They both grew up determined to see India become independent in their lifetime. They were both very gifted in different areas. And for a while, Bose, followed a path that many future leaders of independent nations followed. The constitutional politics. He was a protester. He was an agitator, but he led the Congress Party for a while. Had he made different choices, he could have ended up as the first prime minister of an independent India. In fact, I'd say he had a good chance of doing that. But he went a certain way. He went down the route of, well, I would say he fell for the glamour of the dictators, the men of action of his time, and that's his tragedy, in my view. Tim is a very interesting character, though, because he rises through the Indian Army, which is an amazing institution. And I said I fell in love with Angela Noblet. I kind of fell in love with the Indian Army. I didn't know much about it until I started working on this book. And it's such a remarkable institution, and it becomes such a very important and powerful force, not only in the victory over the Japanese, but in creating the architecture of the new independent India. And that's what Timmy decided was his life's work. He was tempted to leave. As you said, his own brother followed Bose. For those who don't know, Bose makes a deal with first the Germans, then the Japanese. He forms and leads this independent army. And a lot of Indians who see the world the way Timmy does do go across and follow Bose. Timmy's own brother, as you say, and they're very close. And there's a real chance he even have to fight his brother on a battlefield. This is American Civil War stuff, brother against brother. Very intense, but Timmy doesn't really believe Bose and his promises. He doesn't think the route to independence should lay through a Japanese victory. Doesn't trust the Japanese. Japanese don't help by the consistently terrible way they behave towards Indians and indeed anybody that they temporarily conquer. But having said that, we shouldn't forget that when they initially sweep through the region, they're very popular. Something British people don't like to talk about, but they were very popular. It was a thrilling moment for people who saw the world like Bose did, and also many nationalists in the other parts of the region. So Timmy is torn, he's conflicted. In the end, his loyalty to the army and his vision of the future wins out. But he's very matey with the Nehru family, Motilal Nehru, who is the father of the future prime minister. And he advises him to stay in the army, no matter how badly the British treat him. And he does have all sorts of scrapes, but he nearly walks out lots of times. But he stays with it because he has faith in the institution, and I think he sees if India is to be truly independent, it will need an army, and he wants to lead it, and indeed he does. So I would say he should be celebrated in modern India, but he's virtually unknown there. And I would say Bose should not be, and yet he's probably the most famous Indian of that time and widely celebrated. And how that happens and how history kind of works and why it's just really unfair and annoying sometimes is another thing I've tried to encode into the book.
Yeah, so they're Timmy is a builder, so he is using his training in the army and his training by the British to build something which the Indians can use after the British have gone, which can become the foundation of an Indian state. So it's a very positive way of approaching things. And yes, Bose, the story of Bose was really reminding me so much of so many, it has so many contemporary resonances. At one point, you say that Bose, of course, went to Cambridge, and you say at one point that the Oxford and Cambridge universities contributed more to the revolutionary decolonial ideology than did the Marxists and the actual revolutionaries elsewhere, than did the Marxists and the Comintern and people like that. And there were more sympathizers with decolonization in India. Perhaps there were even more sympathizers among the intellectuals of Oxford and Cambridge than there were among Indians. And that is very resonant, of course, right now, seeing people marching in Sydney in favor of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which I just can't even fathom.
Well, I share your surprise and disappointment at that sort of thing. Of course I do. But that was a slightly flippant remark, but I actually think it's probably true. There are lots and lots of people who I think I say at some point, the British, when they're not locking people up, and yes, occasionally hanging them, let's be honest, when they're not locking people up, they're capable of being seducers, a word that Bose himself uses. They offer the gifted young people of their empire the chance to come and talk, and maybe we can find a way forward. And some of it is classic divide and rule, that maybe it's insincere. What is it? Gandhi used to say, uncashable check on a crashing bank, the British promises. But, in the end, had Bose not thrown in his lot with the fascists and the Japanese militarists, I think there's a very good chance he would have certainly he would have been a rival to Nero as the first prime minister. And he had many attractive qualities. That's why he's such a great character. And he's really worshipped. He expected to be, and he is. He saw himself always as much a prophet as a political figure. And his writing it's kind of, maybe to our taste, a little cloying and a little over the top, but it found and finds a very ready audience. He's very much admired in modern India. He's credited with lots of things he didn't do and victories that he never had. But which is just, I'm afraid, the way history works. If enough people want to believe something, whether that thing is that Bose drives the British out of India, or that thing is there is a genocide happening in Gaza, people will believe it because an awful lot of them want to, whether or not it's true or not. You can't. I would say both of those things are not true.
You cite Salman Rushdie, who says what is true and what is real are not the same, are not always the same.
I love that quote. I mean, I put it in the book, and yes, something does not have to be true to be real. So all of the things that Bose is remembered for, many of them are not true. But they're certainly real. They're really important. There's a 10-part series that Amazon made, hugely successful, beautifully made, emotionally manipulative, lachrymose, but very exciting drama about Bose and his army, which is full of very, stories that really are not true, in my opinion, but certainly highly exaggerated. And yet, he's heroic, maybe because it's easier now to hero worship somebody. Whereas at the time, it was harder because you realized he was hanging out with the people who were massacring civilians and all the rest of it. But there's no series made about Timmy, and I think that's really sad. I think Timmy's adventures and the genuine victories are rather more historically important than Bose's.
Yeah, I agree. Bose was such a swashbuckling character, and he was also he was so camp. I mean, he was such an immense kind of such a good
Camp's
self-promoter.
a good word, actually. Yeah. And I think that I mentioned he sort of fell in love with the glamour of the age of dictators, and as much Stalin as Hitler, but the idea that a time in history had arrived, the old world was not working. It was time for new men, new vision, new energy, somebody at the head of a paramilitary state who would really get things done. And he really went for that in a big way, I think.
And
what
he
is
chose
demagogue,
very
I think.
unwisely. It didn't work. You have a wonderful passage here, which I'm going to read, where you say,
do
so you're talking about, so Bose went to Berlin to look for support for an independent India from the Nazis. And as you detail in the book, he actually visited a concentration camp together with Haj Amin al-Husseini, the exiled Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who became the kind of leader of the Palestinian movement. And he actually saw, it was a labor camp rather than a death camp, but he saw a concentration camp, and he was very close to some of the people who were most heavily involved in and complicit in the final solution.
Oh, yes,
So
who had been to the Wannsee conference, in fact.
Yes,
he knew men who had
exactly.
been to that meeting, yes.
Yes. He knew them quite well, it seems. And so there's a kind of steel manning justification of Bose that you make here. Also later, he, of course, sided with the Japanese. He kind of overlooked the rape of Nanking, which really reminds me of 7th October 2023. That was one of the most horrific just bouts of wanton and gleeful rape and slaughter and torture. And you do steelman the idea of the justification of Bose. In this passage, you say, throughout Bose's life, the moral judgments made about him and the ones he made about himself, for he was nothing if not self-aware, all came down to priorities. If liberating a subcontinent from an empire that had subjugated it for centuries was the focus of your life, then that was all that mattered. Clarity and focus was all. Any unpleasant whispers you might hear about what your new allies are doing to some other people in some other place must necessarily take second place. Bose makes for a soft target now. It's easy to contrast him at a gossipy drinks party with what was happening at the exact same moment in town squares, forest clearings, and isolated quarries across Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic provinces of the Soviet Union. Places from where stories of the difficult work being done by specialized military units and their often enthusiastic local assistants did indeed make their way back to Berlin that summer and autumn. But his many defenders would argue, how can any of that horror be allowed to discredit Bose's pursuit of his dream of independence for India and a better world for all humanity? How can it gainsay his deep and proven commitment to communal coexistence and racial tolerance? A man doing a great thing in a bad world is still doing a great thing, is he not? If troops representing the men calling you Excellency and serving you strudel are massacring Jewish women and children thousands of miles away, and you half know and half don't know about it, then why should that stop you pursuing a very different and decent policy of your own? It's just that you need the help of these dangerous people to bring a better world to fruition. Look what Lenin had to do. Remember all those guns shipped into Dublin during the last war. So lots of broken eggs in that omelette.
Well, I mean, it was those were the ways he rationalized it to himself. He was very self-aware. There's another passage, I think, close to that where one of his friends, his Indian friends, all had a very left-wing background, most of them, do raise objections. And he says something very clear. He says, well, whatever the Germans are doing in Europe is not our concern. It's just not. We have a bigger cause. We must hold to it. And, because I have grown up in a part of the world and in a culture that's extremely interested and aware of the Holocaust, for example, or indeed the rape of Nanking, I immediately rushed to a certain judgment of him. And there's a passage I'd cut out from the books that was a bit over the top, where I sort of contrast into Robespierre or maybe Pol Pot. People who are so determined to perfect humanity, they don't really care how many actual humans die along the way. But there is something of that in him.
I agree.
I suppose also, the way that he is now seen in India, and I think there's another parallel. You mentioned 7th of October. I find it very distressing, having covered the peace process in Northern Ireland as a journalist. I find it very distressing to see groups like NECAP and others embracing a very out IRA all the way, the heroes who gave us our freedom. And of course, if you were in it at the time, you realize it's nothing like so simple. And in the 90s, when I was doing my reporting, people at rock concerts were embracing the peacemakers, and we were thrilled at the idea that there might be some coming together of these communities. And if you've ever seen the wonderful Irish TV series Derry Girls, that captures that atmosphere beautifully. But now, 20 or 30 years later, it's kind of cool to embrace the extremists because it's simple, isn't it? They were, it's simple. They never compromised. They just fought for us. And I think there's a lot of that in Bose, the way he's seen in India now. You have to deal with the messy reality of having him in your world. The fact that he will go to Nanking, where this spectacularly brutal, sadistic orgy of sexual sadism takes place, and he gets up and makes a speech about Asian values, which he does.
It's incredible.
It blows my mind, really.
Absolutely Orwellian,
But they will not, he does. He goes to Nanking, where he knew and everybody knew what had happened there, and talks about a future of Asians, Asia for the Asians, a place where Asians had slaughtered other Asians in ways that it doesn't bear thinking about. And yet somehow the men of violence are glamorous. And you mentioned 7/10. I was as stunned as you are, but long before a single bomb had fallen on Gaza, the joy on the streets of this act of spectacular sexual sadism performed in public, joyfully, as a sacrament to God. And there they all are on the streets in a kind of religious ecstasy over it. Turns my stomach. It scares me. It scares me a lot about young people and their attitude to the information that's presented to them, and how easy it is in an age of TikTok to whip people up in a kind of emotional frenzy over something that they don't really understand.
Just returning to India and the Second World War. So one of the things that you talk about is there are kind of two contrasting things going on here in attitudes towards the Raj. First of all, you point out something that Nigel Biggar also talks about, which is that the British could not have held power in India for so long without the participation of many people in India. So there was the number of British actually in India was tiny amid these many, many millions of people. So most of what they were doing in British India was administered by and facilitated by Indians who participated in this. And for many reasons, but among other reasons, the ways in which Indians were treated by the ways in which, for example, lower caste Indians were treated by upper caste Indians, and the way in which almost everybody was treated who lived in a princely state and wasn't part of the court, were so extraordinarily and extremely oppressive. It was such a rigid and oppressive caste-based society that this was a relatively benign regime, and many people chose to be part of it. So part of that is expressed, I think, in the fact that so many Indians volunteered to fight in the Indian Army for the British in the Second World War. And I believe you said that no Indians were conscripted. These were all volunteers. Is that correct?
It's the largest volunteer army in history of the planet. 2.5 million people volunteer to fight. Although I think a lot of them are drawn by the promises of men like Timmy that this is going to be it. Things will change. And I think after 42, it was obvious they would. Independence was now suddenly very much on the agenda. So, and a lot of those people like Timmy himself are from the Hindu community. Historically, the Hindus had been kept out of the army because of the revolution in the 19th century. And there was this, idea that was very held in India, but especially in Britain, that they were the martial races. In other words, these are the people the British could trust. And they are the Muslims of the Punjab, the Sikhs of the Punjab, and the Nepalis, the Gurkhas. I mean, Timmy is none of those, and his family were military too. So he was the exception that proves that rule. But the influx of independence-minded Hindus into the army is a massive change. And Bose is convinced they'll all defect. Bose is convinced the minute that his lot start fighting, and they do in early 44, the minute that happens, the ordinary Indians in the Indian army will just massively defect to him. And hardly any of them do. They seem immune to his propaganda. And again, I think that's a mix of loyalty, a sense, yes, of patriotism to the empire, but also a sense that the best route to independence is by staying where they are and not trusting the Japanese in the way that Bose does. Also, the Japanese continually massacre people throughout this story, including some of Bose's own people. There's one of my favorite stories in the book, the Andaman Islands. It's the only part of India that is ever taken by Japan. And they see a great opportunity to make a political point. So Bose goes there, runs up the flag. This is celebrated in Indian newspapers only the last, I mentioned, 2023. How it was extraordinary that Bose goes to this island and shows the... Well, about 2 weeks after Bose has gone to that island for the photo op, the Japanese kill about 40 of his own people without a trial. And he can't do anything to stop them. So I think that, and in a nutshell, is why the Indian army holds together. But you mentioned the fact that certainly in the early parts of the early years of the war, there's enormous enthusiasm for the army. It has victories in North Africa, for example. There are huge street marches, and people have days off, and they have parties in villages and factories. Indian people celebrating the Indian army fighting for Britain. So yeah, there is a sense that, we're not just subjects, we're participants in this venture. But I think you could overplay that as well, certainly among intellectuals. The tide had been running very strong for independence throughout the 30s. And after 42, when Britain shows itself to be pretty terrible at the one thing it's supposed to be good at, which is running everything. 42 is a very bad year. After that, the genie's out of the bottle and it ain't going back. Independence will happen.
What happens in 42 to
Well,
make
42,
that
the British
clear?
start losing lots of battles. They lose Singapore, which is the great imperial fortress. They're driven out of Malaya. They're driven out of Burma amid terrible scenes of racial discrimination. A lot of Indians work in Burma. They try to flee. Some British units protect them and do their best, but there are well-publicized stories of Indians being turned away from relief boats and refugee boats. So they have to walk, because as they walk, they die, they get attacked, they get ill, it's hot, there's bugs. And the white British are looked after. And that strikes a very, Gandhi, for example, cannot believe what he's seeing, and he's not the only one. Because then the Congress Party launches its Quit India campaign, which is really savagely oppressed by the British. And that's the biggest kind of domestic revolution since 1857, the Indian Mutiny, or the First Revolution, as the Indians would call it. And then to cap it all off, there's the Bengal famine, which is, despite what some people tell you, not created by Britain, but very badly bungled by a mixture of British and Indian administrators. And nobody knows how many people died. It's probably 2 million. And that, you'd think the combination of those three things would see the end of any British, anybody believing that the Britain's worth serving. And yet, extraordinarily, and I think largely to do with the fact that the army gets really good. In 43, 44, 45, there's a big surge of, certainly 44, 45. There's another surge of kind of patriotism again, pride in the victories that are happening, and a desire to beat the Japanese. But by now, the army has changed so much psychologically and demographically that it's clear that there will be independence. I mean, that the offer is more or less made in 42, and it's kind of double underlined by 44 that it's going to happen. It's such an interesting story. I mean, I had no idea of the twists and turns before I looked into it, and I thought I knew a lot about the Second World War.
Yeah, so one of the things that you talk about is that from the perspective of British history, from a European or American perspective, there's this view of Britain as the plucky little underdog during the Second World War, whereas for many people, the British were the boot in your face, right? And there was... So what kind of role did the Atlantic Charter play in the relinquishing of the colonies? And how was... Can you kind of outline for people just how connected the war effort with the relinquishing of the colonies and independence?
And I guess that's what the book's really about. And all three of my books...
Is that too huge a topic?
It's fine. I'll just ramble on. All three of my books really, the first one about 1940, the sort of insight, this felt 25 years ago like a new insight. I think various other writers and others, historians, David Edgerton, James Holland, a few others, have also written now in similar ways. But the idea that Britain has this strange psychological quirk, that we love to think of ourselves as the underdogs hanging on. There's Dunkirk, there's the Dad's Army myth, there's the Blitz, of course, rationing, the Battle of Britain.
I'm half Indian, so I'll just say that I don't know about the we, but carry on.
Okay, well, so there was a lot. That was how it was seen. And actually, if you look at it coldly and strategically, Britain had a huge amount of strength in 1940. The RAF was probably better than the Luftwaffe, certainly more modern and better led. It was never really losing the Battle of Britain, despite what you might see in various movies. It beat them pretty comprehensively from day one. And the reason that Britain has this strength is its enormous depth of resources, which is the empire, the dominions and the empire. Massive navy, huge merchant fleet, oil and food, and it's all coming in. And the U-boats, again, slightly hyped. One day I'm going to write a book, U-boat, Schmoo-boat, in that, yes, it was a bit scary for maybe the first 3 months of the war, but really, especially as soon as America gets involved, the U-boat, you can forget about them really as a strategic threat. Britain is powerful. Britain's an empire. The good things Britain does and the bad, and there are some bad things in this book, the good things and the bad are all connected. You mentioned Douglas Peterkin, somebody who ends up in Belsen doing the most extraordinary things. But he's only in
Amazing.
Belsen doing those amazing things because of some things that aren't quite so pleasant, which is the sort of cold, calculating, boot in the face side of Britain, which, to be honest, is the way Britain was always seen by most people outside its own borders. Not as an underdog, as an overdog, as the preeminent global bully, really. Yes, we ruled, if we could, with local alliances and with a light touch. But, it wasn't always like that. There's some moments of great ruthlessness and brutality in the story of Britain's empire. And so that is how we were seen, as kind of clever, calculating, a little bit untrustworthy, Albion perfide, as the French would say. There are still people in Russia and Tehran who think that Britain pulls the strings for the entire planet, which is kind of nonsense. But that attitude grows from that era. And I want to be honest about Britain. I really do believe in a warts and all approach to history. In the latter part of this book, there's a lot of stuff that I think Britain does that's kind of shameful and certainly mistaken and foolish, especially when it comes to Vietnam, which we might get onto. But I don't think you can separate the bad from the good. Britain's an empire. Deal with it. That is what the book's about. And it's an empire that actually, yes, India's going to go, but there's a determination across British politics that for many other places we'll hang on to it for another couple of decades if we can, because we need the money and the pride.
Yeah.
But most of the money.
So you said that Brock Peterkin was in Belsen for reasons that were connected to the boot in the face aspect of empire. Can you explain that?
Well, I guess I just mean it's British power that allows Britain to survive the great challenge of 1940, which is the moment when Hitler could have won the war. It is the decisive turning point of the war in the West. It's British power that allows us to hang on and keep and grow and build the alliance with the Americans. And of course, eventually it enables D-Day and it enables the armies to sweep into Germany. And that's why he's in Belsen with the resources of the British military medical service, which does such extraordinary work, which is a story that there are no good news stories about the Holocaust. There are no good news stories about the Holocaust. But the story of what they do in Belsen is little told and remarkable. And it is in itself, in its own little microcosm, a very good news story. But that's as much Britain as what they're doing in Vietnam, is the point I'm making in the book. That we need to understand it all in full for a proper reckoning, hence the title.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Peterkin and Belsen, and I'm going to read a passage. The book is really kaleidoscopic, and you do intercut, is that the terminology? You do intercut between the different characters as you're going along chapter by chapter. It reads very much like a novel. It's written like a novel. It has this novelistic tone and pacing to it.
Oh, thank you. Well, I did, as I mentioned, there were actually rather more. There was quite a bit more in Europe that I cut out because I thought there's too much going on. I mean, there's quite a lot going on anyway, but there was too much. So I took that decision that no writer wants to do, throwing away about 2 months' research.
There's such a wide range of theatres of war that are covered here, and I do want to get on to some of the others, but
now let's talk about Belsen, because I'm proud of that section of the book.
Let's talk about Belsen. I'm just going to read from the very beginning of this. Captain Douglas Peterkin and his fellow medics struggled to empty the huts in anything like an orderly fashion amid distressing scenes of panic and despair. They would arrive draped in their white anti-typhus overalls and carrying stretchers to discover crowds of people desperate for medical treatment and food, making the job of choosing whom to help first almost impossible. But for those who are carried to Johnny Johnson's human laundry and able to tolerate the various food supplements now being offered, the changes could be rapid and remarkable. 3/4 of the survivors were women and girls, and most had been living in a desperate, exhausted and emaciated state for weeks now. The long and detailed equipment lists for 11 light field ambulance never contained quantities of lipstick or face powder, but Peterkin and his commander Mervyn Gonin soon discovered that such things could be lifesavers too. So here you're quoting from Peterkin's diary. A very large quantity of lipstick arrived. This was not at all what we men wanted. We were screaming for hundreds and thousands of other things. And I don't know who asked for the lipstick. I wish so much that I could discover who did it. It was the action of genius, sheer unadulterated brilliance. I believe nothing did more for these internees than the lipstick. Women lay in bed with no sheets and no nightie, but with scarlet red lips. You saw them wandering around, with nothing but a blanket over their shoulders, but with scarlet red lips. I saw a woman dead on the post-mortem table, and clutched in her hand was a piece of lipstick. At last, someone had done something to make them individuals again. They were someone, no longer merely the number tattooed on their arm. At last, they could take an interest in their appearance. That lipstick started to give them back their humanity. Really extraordinary moment.
Yeah, thank you. One of those things you find and you think, gosh, I've read that a few times at events. People have cried, and it's very emotional. And
yeah, I'm
what they did,
yeah.
what they did, what those men did there, and women, mostly men. They did actually bring in quite a few medical volunteers, students, men and women students, volunteered to fly in from British colleges, even though they knew that they had a very good chance of catching typhus, which a lot of them did, including Peterkin. But what they did there in those 2 or 3 weeks is still studied, in terms of famine relief, dealing with kind of mass panic and starvation and typhus. And it's very little celebrated. I mean, it's a story that the famous footage, the terribly distressing footage, which really cemented the Holocaust in the Western imagination, I think, was filmed at Belsen, of all the bodies being kind of bulldozed into the mass graves. That's what people remember. They don't remember that 20 or 30,000 people's lives were saved by imagination and ingenuity and hard work of men like Peterkin. And what was the most extraordinary thing, you talk about emotion, I got to meet somebody who he had personally, directly saved. And for this book, unlike my previous, pretty much everybody in it is dead, but I did get to meet Eddie Boas in your city of Sydney, who was 5 years old at Belsen. I was actually on one of those trains that was these terrible death trains or lost trains where, nearly half the people on them died. And Peterkin gets typhus himself. He's sent to Leipzig. This is in the weeks, the war's now over. And he comes across Eddie's family, basically begging in the streets. He's not on duty. He doesn't have to do anything. There's millions of people like that wandering around Europe, thousands and thousands of them. And he sees the signs of typhus and he helps this family, gets them into a hospital, gets them back to get some food and treatment and gets them back to Holland, where they're one of the very, very, very small number of Dutch Jews who survives the war. So that's the guy. That's what the measure of the man that he was. And then if I can keep going for 2 more minutes, I discovered that
you can keep going as long as you like.
I have a personal connection to this man. I was going to write about a very small story at the end set in my mother-in-law's little village in Devon, where the local doctor in the new NHS, the National Health Service, it's kind of Britain's unofficial religion, starts. And this guy's life, the young boy's life, is saved from polio. And that is my father-in-law. So without that moment of medical intervention, I wouldn't have a wife or the children that I have. Okay, it's a small thing in the story of the war. But it was Peterkin. So I wanted to write, I researched it, and then I very soon came across this PhD he'd written about his experiences in Belsen. And then I found more and more sources for that. And I couldn't believe it. This guy, who my family had talked about my whole, for decades, was one of the great unsung heroes of the Second World War. And I got to meet his family. Eddie Boas, this boy who he saved, came to London to do a speech. And I took Jennifer, my mother-in-law, to meet him. And there they were, two people whose lives had been touched by the same man. One small story in Devon, two huge global event, the Holocaust. And yet both their lives, set on a new trajectory by this one man. I mean, that's why we write history, isn't it? And read it. I mean, that connection between the past and the present, thrilling. But you know what? Just to go back to the other thing we've talked about, this was at the Wiener Holocaust Library in Russell Square, beautiful Russell Square. a place, by the way, which was attacked on the 20 years ago by suicide bombers. And on the walls of that very library, within, I don't know, a few weeks of this, I'm talking 2023, 7/10 happens, and then the graffiti comes. The anti-Jewish graffiti comes in that very place where I'd seen that remarkable connection between, the modern world and the heroes of the Holocaust. So whatever that means, well, it doesn't mean good things. And I saw later that day, things like, I don't want to become one of these crusty old red-faced, I've got a lot of faith in young people, but I saw these 3 young people on the bus, and one of them, they can't have been more than 20, they were probably 18, was showing the others on his phone a TikTok about the protocols of the elders of Zion in 2023.
Yeah.
Because they explain, look, mate, this explains it. They've always been like this. It's the plan, mate. It's the plan. London, 2023.
Unbelievable.
A week after, I think maybe even less than a week after 7/10, young people getting into the same shit that led us to Belsen. Terrifying. So simple, isn't it? It's like, the IRA, I love kneecap. Bose is the hero. Oh, the protocols, mate, on my phone. These are all bad things.
You also tell a story of 2 people who are on one of the death trains. That's quite an extraordinary story. Do you want to?
Well, I mean, it's the same train that Eddie was on. They think they're lucky they're taken out of Belsen when it's already bad. It's terrible. People are already dying. But they're taken out, I think, 3 weeks before the end. So in a sense, they're lucky that they missed the worst of it, because by then there's no food and the typhus is everywhere. And they do get a bit of food on the train because they're tradable. They're tradable Jews. They're being taken. And the SS is selling Jews in the final weeks of the war. And some Jews are actually evacuated through Czechoslovakia, and they're saved that way. And this is the plan. But it all goes wrong because Germany's falling apart. So none of the trains. Oh no, one of the trains.
They're selling them to whom?
To the West.
By the way, sorry.
International Jewish organizations are buying Jews.
Are paying, yeah.
And to relief camps in Switzerland. So yeah, of the 3 trains, one does make it to Czechoslovakia, although nobody is then traded because the war's over. One is found by American troops. There's some very famous photographs. One's in the book of them opening the cattle trucks and these women just coming out looking like they've said the joy of being saved, but also the horrible privations, and you can tell their emaciated faces. And anyway, Eddie is on the 3rd train, and that rumbles around Germany in a kind of shambolic way for nearly 2 weeks, and eventually they run into the Red Army, and the Red Army release them and treat them very well, actually. And then he ends up in Leipzig, and that's when he meets Peterkin. But yeah, there's so much going on in those final weeks. And a lot of people go out their way to help when they don't need to, Peterkin being one of them. Yeah.
I want to talk about a couple of things that were stories that I didn't know about before reading this book that were surprising to me. One, I think, is was happening in Vietnam. Let's go to that theater for a moment, where the Allied troops were actually recruited former Japanese prisoners of war. They were called Japanese surrendered persons, JSPs, to fight alongside their own troops. That is kind of stunning. Talk a little bit about how that happened.
Well, we're getting to the part of the book that I guess you could call anti-colonial. You mentioned Nigel Biggar. He's very nicely endorsed the book, as have various academics. For those who don't know, Nigel Biggar is a very well-known defender of the British imperial tradition.
We interviewed him for Quillette, actually.
Yeah. And,
and I've met him, yeah.
On the other side of it, there are people who are very, very critical. And I've actually been lucky enough to get help from both sides of this. But when it comes to Vietnam, it is one of those stories that is surprisingly cynical and I think mistaken. Ho Chi Minh is running the Viet Minh. They're working with the Americans. The OSS is with him. That's the forerunner of the CIA. They're sending all these reports back to Washington saying, this is the guy. He's very popular. in the north, but all over the country. He's fighting with us against the Japanese. This is the one to support after the war. Roosevelt's kind of cool with that because Roosevelt doesn't want the French. Sorry, backtrack. This is all part of the old French Empire. Roosevelt doesn't like de Gaulle and it doesn't want the French back in Indochina. Unfortunately, Roosevelt dies. But also, America is changing its views about the whole colonial thing anyway. So the OSS think that they have the green light to support Ho Chi Minh. They actually write the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, which Ho Chi Minh makes, is written with the help of the Americans and indeed quotes from the American Declaration of Independence in its opening paragraph, a remarkable detail of history. Unfortunately, de Gaulle and Churchill are talking somewhere else, and they want to keep the old imperial show on the road. So a decision is made to send a French army and a British army to take back control of Vietnam. The OSS initially think this is crazy because they think Ho Chi Minh's the guy, but now there's another man in the White House. He doesn't seem to care much, and it just happens. Maybe Truman had other things to think about. Or maybe the fact that there's a Cold War looming affected everybody's judgment because Ho Chi Minh's a communist. But he's a communist who really wants to be friends with us and has been an ally. So they get there. The guy Leclerc, who was a French general, he's a great hero of the liberation of Paris, but he's not come to Vietnam to liberate anybody. In fact, a quote from him is he's come to secure the future of the white race in Asia. How's that? It all kicks off. Everybody's fighting everybody else. It's chaotic. They're short of troops. Ho Chi Minh's furious because he thinks that the Americans have done the dirty on him. And there are big banners all over Saigon saying, Americans and British welcome, French go home, your empire finish. But no, fighting breaks out. The British and the French are short of troops, so what do? They release Japanese prisoners, tens of thousands of them. They give them rifles. They send them into battle. This is weeks after the end of the war. What's in all the newspapers of the world at this time? Shocking stories from emaciated survivors of death railways and labor camps and the terrible things the Japanese did. It's all over the world's news. Some of these soldiers will have done those things, but that doesn't matter. They're there, they're willing, they fight with the British, they drive the Ho Chi Minh out of Saigon, and then the war continues, the British leave, the French are back. But what's been achieved there by that decision? The ground has been laid for 30 more years of carnage in that country. A French Vietnam War, an American/Australian Vietnam War, millions of dead Vietnamese, Agent Orange, everything. Slaughter, American society torn apart. And at the end of it, Ho Chi Minh's in charge, which is what the OSS recommended in 1945, because he did have popularity. And he was the obvious person to take over. So this kind of mad imperial, I call it imperial muscle memory, for the want of a better phrase. It's just the way the world was, how people thought. And if the Americans weren't going to stop them, de Gaulle and Churchill were going to put the old imperialists back. Oh, by the way, that also included Vichy people who'd been collaborating with Hitler. They also get back into their old palaces in Indochina. A terrible moral disgrace, I would argue.
Yeah.
But foolish, strategically so very foolish. In the middle of the Vietnam War, in 1974 or 73, a lot of these old files from the OSS, if somebody finds them and they put them in the Washington Post or some other paper. And the Americans can't believe it. Well, this guy was our ally, and our own spies were saying he was the one that should take over because he's really popular. Madness. So that's a part of the story that was important to me to tell because I want to show, that the empire, the old imperial show was on the road, and while amazing things are happening with the British in Belsen, some very stupid and terrible things are happening to show the British kind of at their worst, really, in that old caricature, the cold, calculating, ruthless, selfish. Yeah, that side of things was alive and kicking, I'm afraid. So it's both there are stirring patriotic passages in this book, which would please Nigel Bigger, no doubt. But I mean, I mustn't make Nigel seem simplistic.
I wouldn't caricature Nigel too much.
No, he's open. He's open to lots of things. I do know that.
Yes, I feel he's partly just making an argument that's not often made, and so
he is, and he's an interesting voice, and a lot of the things he says I totally agree with. But there are other things in the book that would probably provide evidence to his detractors. Let me say that.
Yeah, of course. I want to talk a little bit about the Australians.
Yes,
since I am a patriot, and I mean, I've only been in Australia for 2 years, but I'm already consider myself Australian to the core. And so you talk a lot about Arthur Titherington, who was a Japanese prisoner of war. Those are quite horrific parts of the book. But I wanted to also look at another part of the book. I think this is the chapter that you call The Horror, and much of it is set in Borneo. And it deals with the various activities and mostly failures, basically a completely failed project in Borneo, which involved a group called the SRD and the Operation Semet, as it was called, and also their failure to protect the people they came to protect, and also to rescue a bunch of Australian prisoners who were being held in absolutely horrific conditions. An operation to rescue them, which was called Operation Kingfisher, got kind of downgraded and deprioritized. And that turned out to be a horrible and tragic mistake. And it also headhunting took place there. one of the more kind of fun parts of the book. Can you talk a little bit about the circumstances in Borneo that you write about?
It is a very tangled and complicated story, Borneo. And when I'm coming to Australia, I'm going to be doing a few sessions with some in Canberra. And one of them will be with Christine Halliwell, who wrote the book on Operation Seamut. And I'm very grateful to Christine. She shared.
Is that open to the public? Can I come?
You certainly can. I'm speaking with Chris Masters in Sydney as well.
I'll certainly come to Sydney, but I can get to Canberra easily.
Well, that'd be lovely. You'd be very, very welcome. I mean, I'm quite nervous of this event, and Christine, or if she ever watches this, because I think I go a bit further in my analysis than she does. She writes, and she has these unique interviews both with Bornean people themselves, because she's really an anthropologist, so that was her background, and with the survivors of Seamut while they were still with us. And her book is remarkable. It's just a personal memoir, anthropology, military history. But what I did in my book was to tell.
Sorry, what's her book called?
It's just called Seamut, S-E-M-U-T. It's a really, really interesting book. But she tells the story of this guerrilla, this kind of secret operation, mostly Australian, run by a New Zealander, actually, Toby Carter. And it turns out that even though the idea is they're preparing the way for an invasion of Borneo by an Australian division in the final weeks and months of the war, there's also a kind of hidden agenda from London, a colonial agenda, to sort of sound the local people out for a return to British rule. And this is another example of how kind of colonial politics start to intrude with military priorities. Long story short, they have various adventures, one of which is they do indeed start to pay the local communities, the Dayak communities, for human heads, something that is a very important part of their culture, but had been forbidden for many decades by the kind of old colonial authorities. They draw a lot of people to their cause by saying, not only will we permit it, we will give you weapons and we'll pay you for their heads.
Japanese heads.
This is not written about much at the time because it's actually against the Geneva Convention to desecrate a body of a victim. Although, in war, all sorts of terrible things happen, of course. Anyway, long story short, there's a classic kind of breakdown in communications. And when the Australian division arrives, by now they've stirred up this war in the jungle, in the interior, and they promise everybody that they'll have protection. The invasion's coming, we'll have tanks and planes, you'll be fine. Because the local people, they only have, a couple of hundred armed men, against there are thousands of Japanese troops who are, have a well-deserved reputation for brutality. And they've been fighting them. And the SRD officers have said, don't worry, when the invasion comes, it'll all be fine. Well, the invasion comes, and then they just sit there on the coast, and they don't move. And there are all these exchanges between the Australian officers and the special forces people. And it's clear they have an absolute mismatch of expectations. They've not been told about this mission. They don't want to help. They don't much like the people who are doing the mission. They come to regard them as British. Some of them are, some of them aren't. And then when they do occasionally have little meetings, it is, I call it the horror, because it is a bit like Heart of Darkness. One of these regular Australian soldiers turns up to one of these jungle camps and he sees a guy being dragged out, alleged to be a collaborator, and they chop his head off right in front of him. He immediately orders the arrest of the Australian Special Forces guy and says, you're gonna be court-martialed for this, mate. And it has to go all the way to the top of the Australian army, a guy called General Blamey, to sort that one out. So anyway, the Japanese do, of course, turn on the Dayaks. They get minimal help from the Australian army. There's lots of slaughter. There's lots of ambushes. There's lots of horror. And it achieves virtually nothing. And then, to go to your question, finally, it was chosen over another mission to save the men in Sandakan. This is a very well-known story in Australia. And in the years after the Second World War, it was a big political story. There was a very bitter argument about this, but it's kind of been forgotten about in recent decades. Now, again, as I say, I may go a bit further than Christine in my analysis, because I don't know if this mission would have succeeded. It may have been a complete disaster. But we're talking, February, March, April 1945, the Allies have total domination of the air and the sea. Similar missions have been tried elsewhere, and they had worked to get people out of these camps. The Australians knew that men were being massacred and more massacres were coming, and yet they chose to do this sort of weird colonial headhuntery thing instead. And then, of course, after the war, it comes out and there's a big row in the papers. All the relatives of the men who died at Sandakan, 2,500. There were 6 survivors. 6. Why was this mission not done to help our mates? And nobody wants to talk about it. There's a bit of there's a moment where General Blamey, the guy I just mentioned, says, the Americans weren't helpful. And he blames people in Canberra for not putting on enough pressure. And Australia's Prime Minister Shifley is in a towering rage, just says, we've searched our files and there is not a single reference to anybody from Blamey's staff ever once recommending this mission. So that's bullshit. And Australian politics is a full contact sport then and now. And it just goes away. There's very little paper trail. I quote the only sources in the book that are really to be quoted. And it does appear that whoever made the decision, possibly under the influence of London, was more interested in this kind of how can we get our hands on the oil fields than how can we save the lives of our mates. Now, that's an extreme statement. Not everybody would agree with that. And I'm certainly not saying Christie would agree with it. But it's a conversation worth having. And again, it's a side of the story that is kind of dark and complicated and messy, as wars are. And you can be sure a lot of the people who did all this and made all these decisions, well, they actually openly say they destroy paperwork, or all of it was never written down anyway, because that's not the way these guys operate. They're cloak and dagger men. So yeah, I think I also say at one point that I think the headhunting mission just appealed to them more. It's kind of exciting. Guerrilla camps, ambushes, moonlight flights on Catalinas. Maybe it's the sort of thing they wanted to do. And that sounds flippant, but when you learn more about the men they were, I think it might have been a factor.
Yeah. So what do you feel?
It's not Australia's finest hour in the Second World War, but nor is it Britain's. And I don't think we talk about. I know a lot about this, having worked at the ABC and made many programs about the Australian-British relationship and Anzac, like 10 hours of programming for 2015 for the Anzac centenary. There's a long-standing kind of caricature of the way that the Brits, use and abuse the Aussies for their nefarious purposes. And I have to say, this story, Seaboot, kind of plays into that stereotype more than a little bit.
Yeah, it was one of my favorite parts of the book. I have to say, it was fantastically told.
Well, thank you.
What do you feel are the kind of biggest misunderstandings about what was happening in 45, or the things that are most seldom known about?
Well, I never actually answered your question of the Atlantic Charter, did I? The Atlantic Charter, 1941, Churchill's desperate to get Roosevelt in the war. Roosevelt's a passionate critic of empire. He blames the empires of the world for the great recessions of the 30s. The independence, especially of India, has become a big cause on the American left. American writers and intellectuals and newspapers really get behind that. Churchill wants his help, so he signs up to this thing called the Atlantic Charter. And the words in that, which basically say we're fighting a war for self-determination, for the rights of people to choose their form of government. Those words actually are directly quoted in the founding documents of the UN, and they figure in key moments of Allied propaganda, including the morning of D-Day. So that's why we're fighting this war, right? We're fighting this war to build a new and better world. And it's explicitly about decolonialization. The way the Americans talk about it, Churchill from the word go tries to play that side of it down. Weasel, one of his favorite words. He tries to weasel from day one. Anyway, as I say, America changes. Even while Roosevelt is alive, and certainly after he's dead, America's becoming a kind of an empire too. So certain things happen, like in North Africa, the Pacific Islands, when the Allies start taking places over or liberating them from the Germans or the Japanese or the Italians. They're not in a great hurry to let the people there decide the form of government. Because there are bases to be had and there are resources to be had. And so, there's a big backsliding from those principles. Never more so than Vietnam and also Indonesia, where a similar thing happens, although it's not so successful because the Indonesians do get independence after a very bloody war in which, once again, Japanese prisoners were used by the Allies. People don't know this stuff. And it sounds, just hear myself saying it, it sounds like I've written a really sour book saying we're the bad guys in the Second World War. I do not believe that. I have written 3 books about Britain's amazing achievement, that generation. I'm in love with them all, not just Angela, all of them. I think it's amazing. And of course it's positive, perhaps the most positive thing that this country has ever done and ever will do in its history. And yet, to understand it in full, you can't leave the imperial aspect out of it. It's so coded into not only the way people thought and behaved, the way the world saw us and reacted to us.
Yeah, you do debunk a number of the more lurid stories of British racism and some of the various accusations. And I think in a very believable way. And you do talk a lot about the heroism of individual people, like Angela Noblet, the nurse, like Peterkin, the doctor. And there is, I don't feel it's at all a sour and decolonial book, and I absolutely hate the whole ideology of decolonization. But it's also it's a very balanced and realistic portrayal of.
Thank you. It really means a lot. It means a lot because that's what I wanted to do. I really wanted to try and find the right form of words to catch it all, and make it make sense. And one of my favorite passages actually is debunking some of the Bose stuff. There's this famous story about how they witnessed a British ship going down, and all the white officers save themselves, and they give the Indian sailors the rubbish life rafts, and they all drown. And Bose sees this from this submarine. His owner is massive. Bose has many adventures, and he's traveling on this German submarine all the way to Japan or to the Indian Ocean, and he sees this, and it's a story that's often told by the more favorable biographers and websites, of which there are many. And I just dug into it a little bit, and it's all rubbish. It never happened. There were no Indians on that boat.
He couldn't have seen it. Right.
They couldn't have seen it
and
anyway.
He couldn't have seen anyway. Yeah.
No, they couldn't have seen it. It didn't happen. There was Chinese and white people on that boat, and a fair number of both survived, and they had plenty of proper lifeboats. So it just didn't happen. And yet, it's just one of those stories that's so easy to tell, isn't it? If you want to believe, it's a numbers game. If enough people want to believe something, evidence will be provided. And stories will be spun. I mean, I opened the whole account of Bose with the foundational story of his life, this argument with a teacher in his school when he's a teenager. And that story was told in incredibly contradictory ways. Nobody knows what really happened. A very, very small thing, an argument in a corridor, was blown up into something that led to a big pupils' strike and teachers being attacked by their pupils. And it was Bose's big first moment. But even then, it's all about competing stories, but I guess history is, isn't it, generally? So, yeah, I do love that.
Yeah,
I like
yeah.
disinterring and pulling apart the threads a little bit to see why we believe certain things. I once did a biography of Diana, which is largely about why you think things about her. It's based on another TV series I made. Why a lot of the things you think about her are basically rubbish because they're just cooked up with various authors.
Well,
on
India
her
is
side and
so
his.
there's so much hagiography around Bose and the other figures of Indian independence. And I mean, my favorite figure is probably B.R. Ambedkar. Apart from the Parsis, I'll put those to one side, who are, of course, my favorites always. But I did feel quite uneasy in India with the celebrations of Ambedkar Jayanti, the commemorations of his birth and death day, the parades and things. It's absolutely a religious cult. And once a religious cult emerges around a historical figure, then the truth becomes more and more difficult to find out. And if you do find it out, more and more difficult to actually talk about. Because the truth is unlikely to be.
I had some help from some really very generous Indian friends. Tirthankar Roy
I'm sure.
He's an economist at the LSE and a great Bengali intellectual. And he showed me that the politics of Indian nationalism was so much more complicated than I'd imagined. There were a lot of people like Bose who just saw the British as the evil oppressors, had to go. There were quite a few others who said, "Well, hang on a minute, guys. What about can't we sort out the caste system first? Before can't the British help us to kind of make our country a bit more modern and maybe more equitable before they leave?" Because there are all sorts of issues. And as we said earlier, there are huge numbers of people willing and able and keen to work with the British. And both Bose and Tinney's families are from that tradition. Whether it's the army or the civil service or industry. There are a lot of Indians who kept the show on the road. It would have been impossible without them. But as I say, that was changing, and it super accelerates after 42.
Yeah. But it might be part of the reason why when India got its independence, it was, despite all the horrific bloodbaths of partition, India was a relative success story as a post-colonial nation compared with many of the nations in Africa, for example. It wasn't a complete disaster. It remained a democratic country, didn't become a military dictatorship or theocracy, unlike Pakistan, where I grew up. And things basically functioned. And I think a lot of that is because there was at least some desire to build on what had been learned, to learn what you could from the British, to take those things and use them to make a new India, rather than just tearing everything down for the sake of it, which is what happened in a lot of post-colonial countries.
Well, I think you mentioned, in Pakistan, the army have always played such a very powerful role. Timmy's vision for the Indian army, which was very much from Motilal Nehru's father, was for a powerful but politically neutral army. And I think, it's a huge generalization, but that might partly explain the difference paths Pakistan and India have taken. And that there is still a constitutional system in India. And there are still elections, whatever we might think of Modi. And I have to say, I think if Bose had taken over, that might not have been guaranteed. He would not perhaps have been so keen to be voted out, especially if he had his hands on the military. Because I think that was just the way he was inclined. Others would disagree, of course. He's very much admired. And there's a lot of things he wrote actually in the 30s were quite moderate and sensible. But that's perhaps before he got the bug. Standing on a soapbox, it's quite a bug, isn't it? People saluting you, military parades, burning torches. Oof, it's a bit of a...
I think you emphasize that we shouldn't underestimate how seductive the fascists seemed at that period in time. Also, when it seemed that they might be victorious, that there was a kind of something electrifying about seeing people controlling those crowds, making those rousing speeches, speaking and writing that purple prose.
Oh, absolutely.
I find Bose completely unreadable.
He also
But yeah,
admired Stalin very much as well, because
yes,
the transformation of Russia under Stalin, Soviet Union, was something he studied very closely. He thought was very relevant for India, how you could kind of put your economy on fast forward, and in the way Stalin did. And of course, there were many victims of that. Yeah. Omelets, breaking eggs, that kind of view of the world.
Is there anything I haven't asked you that you think I should have asked you, or that you would have liked to have talked about that you haven't had a chance to talk about?
Not at all. I mean, I think there's quite a lot of colour and love stories and dirty jokes, and I do love to try and get under the skin of the time if I can. There's song lyrics and a sense of fun. So I think it just, our conversations may sound quite serious. I try to keep things light. There's at least one very good joke about dysentery. You can't say that about Nigel Bigger's work. Right.
Yeah,
Sorry, Nigel.
It's pretty it's immersive and, as I said, quite novelistic. And it is a number of kind of peepholes. That's not a very good word. A number of little windows.
Vignette.
Like
is the posh French word, sorry.
Yeah. Vignettes, yes. through the BBC, through the like Blue Peter window, through the round window we have Borneo, and through the arched window. Yeah, it's a number of little kind of very vivid portraits of individual people and the war as seen from their perspective. And some of those perspectives are better known than others, and some are very unusual indeed. So
I
it's
really,
fascinating.
I think we've covered all the important stuff. I really appreciate your support, and your, your interest in it. It's not easy to get attention, to be honest. When you write a book, there's so many. So it's lovely to have the chance to, just explain a little bit more of the thinking behind something, and hope that will, interest people enough to give it a try.
Great. Well, please go and get Phil's book.
Yes, please do.
And I put all the links in the show notes, and as usual, the show notes and the full transcript will be on the Quillette site for our subscribers. So if you're listening to this in your podcast app and you want to actually see the references and the transcript, you can find it there. Thanks so much for coming on,
many thanks,
Phil.
and I look forward to seeing you in Sydney and Canberra, or maybe even both.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye.